Hello everyone, my name is Scott Keating. I'm a product specialist here at Side Effects Software, and today I'm going to be talking about rendering fluid and fluid effects using Houdini 12. Now this is sort of a follow-up video to our previous tutorial, which was about simulating a waterfall and spray effects. And as a matter of fact, I really encourage you to go back and watch this tutorial and check out the scene files that were included with it if you haven't done so already, because it'll really help you know exactly what we're talking about, and it's a good place to get started. Now, if you have done the previous tutorial, you'll be familiar with this waterfall image. This is sort of the direction we're going to be going today. Now, there are some elements here that I'm not necessarily going to cover today, because I am going to focus on the spray and water rendering. But as you can see in the background, there's sort of an atmosphere as well as a fur effect. And these stones were actually rendered using fast instancing in Houdini 12. But what I am going to focus on is the fluid, the spray, and how to extract some of this information to be used later in a compositing package. Okay, let's just jump over to Houdini and get started. So as you can see, we have a fairly basic scene set up here with just a sphere and a grid. I've also set up a camera, an environment light, and a spotlight. And just to start, I'm only using the environment light. So let's just jump into my camera here. And you can see we're just starting with a close-up of the sphere. This is just to help us test out our shaders before we get to a more complicated scene like the waterfall. So the first thing I'm going to do is jump over to our out section here and drop down a mantra node. I'm going to scroll down and go into this Properties tab. Scroll down a little bit more, go to the Rendering tab. I'm going to change the rendering engine from micropolygon rendering to physically based rendering. There's a lot of reasons you might like to do this, but it's going to help us rendering some of the other elements a little later down the road. So, it's my preferred way of working for the moment. Also, if I jump over to the render view right now, you'll see that it's picked up the mantra node by default. This may say scene 1. If it does, just put it to camera 1. And hit render. If I scroll out here, you can see that in the top left corner there's this 1280 by 720, and it's picked up that resolution from my my camera, which is a great resolution for rendering, particularly for a final render. But we don't really need to work in that high resolution for the moment, especially when we're just testing out our shader. So the way I'm going to handle that is go on my mantra node, go to this Output tab, and scroll down a little bit. One of our options here is Override Camera Resolution. And if I turn on that checkbox, it opens up this drop-down menu called Resolution Scale. And if I change that to 1/2, you'll see that we get exactly half of our previous resolution. And this is more than enough to allow us to adjust our shader and get a fast result without having to worry about rendering anything at a higher resolution than we absolutely need. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So let's go to the material palette here. The first thing I'm going to do is scroll down and get this checkerboard material. Let me just make a little more room. I'm going to drop that right into the IPR window on top of the grid. And you'll see we immediately get an update in our IPR, which is one of the great benefits of this way of working, particularly when you're just designing a shader. Next thing I'm going to do is scroll up to the top and get this mantra surface node here. I'm going to pull that over and drop it right on top of our sphere. Now you can see that it's going to update using the mantra surface model on this sphere, which looks slightly different than it did previously. You can see maybe it's slightly more specularity here. And we're going to use the mantra surface to get all of the information that we want for our water surface. So let me just click on the mantra surface here in the material palette window and make a little more room. So if you think about a fluid like water, particularly the type of clear mountain river that we're trying to emulate, there's really two elements that we need to be concerned about. There's reflection and refraction. There really isn't a lot of diffuse in something like really clear water. The light tends to either just reflect off of it or go through it. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually turn off this Enable Diffuse tab here on the shader. Now, we may want to bring this back later just to give a slight surface quality to the water, but for the moment, let's turn it off. As soon as we do that, you can see there's something left over. There's this reflection which is coming from our environment light. It's a very blurry reflection at the moment. And then there's this black area down here. And that black area is because by default the shader is set up only to reflect lights and not objects. So we're not actually reflecting any of our checkerboard. So if we go to the reflection tab and then to the reflect objects tab, we can just turn on this reflect objects. And you see immediately we start reflecting our checkerboard in the sphere. But there's something a little strange going on here. You can see that the skylight, our environment light, is actually rendering very blurry, whereas the checkerboard is very sharp. And that's because by default we sort of separate out those parameters. And that's what this checkbox here actually represents: separate object reflection parameters. So right now we're using two different setups for reflecting objects versus reflecting lights. In our case right now, we actually want them to behave the same way. So I'm just going to uncheck this parameter here. Right away you can see we're getting a blurry reflection of our checkerboard down here, and it's matching our sky nicely. But it's probably a little dim, and it's probably a little too blurry. Water generally does have fairly sharp reflections. So the first thing I'm going to do so we can test it is take this specularity intensity and just push it all the way up to 1. Yeah, that's a little better. We can see something that sort of looks a little bit like a chrome sphere or something. Okay, so that's definitely on the right track, but we're definitely still too blurry. So let's just scroll down and take a look at this specular angle parameter here. Generally speaking, this specular angle changes the blurriness of our reflections. So for instance, if I were to increase this quite a bit, you could see our sphere becomes just, it's really indecipherable what's even being reflected anymore. So what we want to do is actually drop it down quite a bit. In fact, let's just put it all the way to 0 for the moment. And now you can see we have a very sharp, very crisp reflection, something like a mirrored sphere. Now this might be a little too much for something natural like water. It's reflecting 100% of the light, and it's doing it perfectly without any sort of loss of image quality. So maybe we'll just turn that to 1 for the moment, just to get a slight amount of blur in there. That's looking pretty good. Now obviously water doesn't just reflect, it also refracts light. And when you're setting up a shader, it's probably a good idea to actually tune each of these things individually rather than doing it all at once, because it can become confusing as to exactly what you're looking at. So for the moment, I'm just going to turn off this enable base reflection layer, which will turn off both the reflect lights and reflect objects. And as you see, we get just a black sphere here. Let's go to the refract tab and turn on enable refractions. There we go, and right away we're getting a very nice result. And partially the reason this looks so nice by default is that our inside index of refraction is set to 1.33. And this number is actually the correct number for an index of refraction for water. In fact, if you were doing other types of material, you could look up this inside index of refraction for the different materials, because this is a number that reflects a certain physical reality. But in our case, 1.33 is great, because that actually is what we need for a water surface. So let's just jump back over to the reflect tab and turn this back on. So now we're getting both reflections and refractions in our sphere, and it's starting to look like something like water, but there's a little sort of murkiness happening here that's a little confusing, because we're basically getting 50% refraction, 50% reflection, and it doesn't quite really look like water. It almost looks like a ball filled with water with some sort of thin plastic reflective material on the outside. Either way, it's just not really what we want. So let's just quickly go over to the settings tab here and turn on this parameter called Fresnel blending. And what this does is create sort of a more physically accurate blending method between refraction and reflection. It's essentially a ratio between how much light goes sort of into an object versus how much is reflected off of it. And you can see the result is that we get a lot of refraction here in the middle, in the sections where the surface is mostly facing the camera. And then as we get to the edge, it gets more and more reflective, until the very edge where you see there's actually quite a lot of reflection. And this is going to give us a much more realistic look. Now, if you look at this and you're still not quite happy, you'd actually prefer a little more reflection. Well, you can actually push the limits of what's physically accurate just by scrolling down to the bottom of our Reflect tab. You can see we have this option called Specular Minimum. And this is basically the minimum amount of reflection that Mantra will sort of allow. So right now it's set to 0, so potentially there are no reflections. If you feel like, even though this is maybe technically accurate, you do want a little more reflections, you can actually just increase this value. And you'll see it starts adding the reflection back in sort of uniformly over the surface of the sphere. I do recommend that if you're going to do this, you probably want to stay at a fairly low value, with maybe just bringing in just a slight hint of a reflection like this in the center of the sphere. And that's actually looking pretty good. If we scroll up to the top and go back to the Diffuse tab, and then enable it, you can see it gets sort of like a vaguely cloudy appearance. And some of that is that we're getting some actual surface lighting apart from reflection and refraction. For something like water, there really isn't very much of this. So you can sort of play around and pick a level that you think looks good. Again, if you are trying to emulate water, I definitely would recommend having a fairly low value here, or just turning it completely off. I personally found that something like 0.05 gave just a slight amount of lighting information, and it helped it feel like maybe there was a little dirt or something mixed into the water. So it wasn't totally pristine, but it also wasn't muddy or murky. So that's the basic setup for the underlying waterfall simulation. Now we need to start thinking about the spray, which has very different surface qualities from something like pure water. So I'm just going to open up a new file with a slightly different setup so that we can take a look at how that's going to work. Okay, so as you can see, we have the same sort of basic setup here, except I've removed the grid, and I've turned our sphere into a particle network. And I did that very quickly just by adding a points from volume and then an add sop, turning on this add particle system. This will just give us a quick way of setting up a shader for a particle network like the spray sim that we set up in our previous tutorial. The first thing I'm going to do is go to the material palette. I'm going to take this clay shader. I'm just going to drop it on one of these points and then go back to our render view. Now here you can see we've got a backlit sort of scenario, so we're not really getting any light coming through our particles. And if we want to emulate something like foam or spray, we definitely want that sort of airy, volumetric feel. Now, there are a lot of different ways you could actually approach that, but the way I decided to do it was by using a feature of Houdini 12 called a uniform volume. And this is basically a very rendering efficient way of rendering a volume that just happens to be uniform. So it simplifies some of the tasks, some of the ray tracing and things that Mantra is going to have to do. It takes a little bit of work to set that up, but it gives you a very nice result. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just make a snapshot of this result so that we can compare it to our uniform volume. Let's go to our shop network and put down a properties node. Once I've got a properties node and I select it, you can press this little sort of container icon or hit Shift-C, and that'll wrap it up into a material so that it operates more or less the same way our clay shader does. Let's just double click and dive in. You'll see our properties node again, and it's connected to this output node. The next thing we're going to want to do is just put down a volume cloud shader and just hook that up to our output. And you can see this is where our shading will be done. It'll give us our density, our cloud density, a color, and a scattering phase. But before we do anything else, we need to set up this properties node. So if we go to this little gear icon and click it, we can go to Edit Rendering Parameters. It'll bring up this window, and I'm just going to make sure it fits so that you guys can see everything I'm doing. Down the bottom left, you'll see this filter, and I've already put uniform volume in there, but by default it's probably something like this. So if I put uniform volume back in there, it filters our results so that we can find what we're looking for. In this case, we want to go to this sampling tab. And there's two parameters we need to grab. One is this volume density. So I'm just going to use this arrow and put it over on our properties node. The second one is this checkbox for uniform volume. So if I click that and put it over and then hit apply and accept. Now if I look at the properties node, you'll see, let's make a little more room, we have this volume density slider and this uniform volume checkbox. So I'm just going to turn that on. Next thing I'm going to do isn't absolutely necessary, but it'll just save you a little time. I'm going to take this volume density parameter here and right click on it. I'm going to click on copy parameter. Then go down to our volume cloud, right click again, and hit paste copied relative references. This way our cloud density in the shader is linked exactly to our properties node. Now that I have that set up, let's just jump up here and rename this material into spray. Then, just like we did before, I'm going to grab this spray node and drag it over here and put it on one of our particles. And right away you can see it's changed significantly. All of our spheres are sort of slightly transparent. You're also getting some interesting areas where sort of light is gathering inside of them. So I'm just going to double click and go back inside here and go to our properties node. Turn the volume density up to, I don't know, something like, let's say 25. And now you can say we have these spheres, but they're backlit. So if I was to go back to compare it to our clay shader, where no light was coming through the spheres at all, now you can see we get sort of a nice, soft, backlit sort of look. And in fact, if I was to go down to our volume cloud here, and then change this shadow density by increasing it, you'll see that not only are we getting a backlit sort of effect, we're also casting shadows from the spheres in the back onto the spheres in the front. So we're getting this nice sort of definition of a overall volume as well as the individual volumes around each sphere. And this is really going to help when we start getting things like these tiny, tiny particles spraying up in the air and hitting the sunlight. Now, you can definitely set up this shader a little more elaborately in order to promote all these parameters and get some nice controls. But for the moment, let's just move forward onto our actual waterfall, scene, and start setting up some of these shaders in the actual context of the waterfall. Okay, so here we are inside our actual scene, and you can recognize this from our earlier animation of the waterfall. So this file is actually going to be included with the tutorial, so I definitely encourage you to sort of dig into it, see how the textures are set up, see how some of the other elements like the fur and the instancing are set up, and get a feel for how a scene like this is really built. But for the moment, I'm still going to just focus on the fluid and the spray rendering. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is just make sure I turn off this fur and this instancing, because it's not really necessary for what we're doing right now. If you look at our scene, you'll see that there is no spray and there is no fluid right now. And that's actually something I've set up to make it a little easier to work in the viewport when I'm setting up lighting and rendering. So if I dive inside my surface node here, you'll see that I am bringing in a file which is our original fluid sim, and then I've got a particle fluid surface and a little cleanup. But I'm actually visualizing this null object, which is really just nothing. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I don't have to deal with what could potentially be quite a lot of geometry in the viewport, when it's really not necessary for what I'm doing. Instead, what I've done is control-clicked on this display flag here. And this purple display flag actually represents a way of telling Mentra to only evaluate these nodes when it's time to render. Now you can sort of work however you like. I personally like to work this way. It keeps things sort of fast and light in the viewport, and it doesn't really affect your render times too greatly to start generating the fluid at render time. It sort of depends on your machine and how much RAM you have. I've also done the exact same thing for the spray. As you can see, I've got a null, and then I have a render flag displayed down here on this FOPSOP. This FOPSOP is actually doing some interesting things with the particle scale over time. So again, when you get this file, I definitely encourage you to sort of dig around and see what things are doing. For the moment though, I'm just going to jump back up here, and then I'm going to go over to our render view. First thing I'm going to do is just make sure we're on our beauty cam here, which we are. And then on our mantra node, you'll see that I've actually have 4 set up, including this one called test renders. The reason I have a test renders mantra node is basically because when you're setting up your basic sort of lighting and camera move, it's really not necessary to have really high quality renders. For a first pass, it's fine to have something fairly low resolution and sort of low sampling as well, just so you can get an idea of how everything is working out before you take the time to actually do a proper sort of high resolution render. Now you can see that I did click the render tag here, and at the bottom it says it's cooking through some nodes. Well, those nodes are exactly what I showed you earlier. Right now it's working on the peak SOP. So now it's building our surface while it's rendering. And once it's done that once, it'll actually render fairly quickly until we change a frame. Here you go, you can see that it's popped up, and now it's starting to actually render the geometry. This really depends on how you like to work. There's no reason you couldn't write your fluid surface out to disk as geometry and just read it off disk that way, which would sort of speed up this initial process. It really just comes down to how you like to work. I personally prefer to do this at render time. So here we are, and we have our waterfall and our spray, and everything's sort of coming in just fine. So the first thing we're going to want to do is start taking into consideration, well, once we've got a nice lighting setup, how do we get this out in a usable format? Because we don't want to just have one beauty pass. We actually want to get all these things in chunks so that we can color correct and break out different layers to use in compositing. And luckily that's actually fairly simple to do in Houdini 12. So I'm just going to make a little more room here, and then I'm going to go to our Out tab. So as I mentioned before, I've set up a couple of different mantra nodes. And the reason for this is that they can deal with different elements one at a time. So for instance, if I just stop our render right now, and I go down to this Render Landscape mantra node, let's just make a little room for you to see. Under the Objects tab, you have these different options here. Now normally this candidate object is set to asterisk, which just means, render everything. But in this case, that's not really what I want. I want to be able to set up a mantra node that gives me exactly the piece of the rendering that I want. And in this case, I want the landscape. So the way I'm going to do that is just use this Force Objects tab to turn on objects that I want. And this is actually great because it gives you a way of setting up the objects you want without having to worry about whether you've turned them on or off in the viewport. Is the display flag in the right place? This sort of overrides all that and just forces those objects to be in the render. And then I've turned on this Force Phantom, and I've put the spray and the surface in there. And what a phantom object basically is sort of an invisible object in the scene that will still cast shadows and show up in reflections the way a real object would. And because I just want the landscape right now, I've used the spray and the surface as phantom. So I can still get the shadows, the contact shadows where the waterfall is supposed to be, while just getting the background as its own layer. So let's actually just change this to Render Landscape and hit render and see what happens. Now you can see that it's creating the geometry already, and it's not cooking through having to rebuild that surface. That's basically because it's already done that for us on the previous render. And until I change something like the frame number or what part of the surface I'm rendering, it'll sort of hold on to that so that we can render more quickly in the viewport. But as you can see, the water in the spray has disappeared, and I'm just getting these darkened areas where the shadowing is coming from. You'll also notice that the rocks and the grass have turned themselves back on. And that's just the real power of setting up a mantra node this way, where you can really select which objects you want on or off at any given time. Now I've done exactly the same thing for our different passes. So again, if I hit stop now and move to our Render Spray tab here, make a little more room, you'll see that I've got forced objects again, and now I've put this forced matte in here. And that's so that I can cut out pieces of the render that I want. In this case, where the water goes behind a rock or is occluded by something, it'll actually add to or cut away to the alpha for that layer. So in this case, I've matted basically all the sort of landscape elements, but I've forced all the objects that I want rendered, like the surface and the spray and so on. In this case, I am just rendering the spray. So again, if I hit render now, oh, I'm sorry, I I do need to change this to render spray. Again, it takes just a second to start creating the geometry. But then very quickly you can see that it's building the surface and it's going to start rendering again. And these rendering these Mantra nodes I've actually set up to have some fairly high quality sampling, even though I've reduced the resolution. So for instance, there is motion blur and depth of field turned on at the moment. But you can see that I've got just my spray now, but it's being occluded by the water surface, which is what we want. We just want the spray sitting on top of the water. We're not really concerning ourselves with what might be under the surface right now. And then the same thing goes for our render waterfall. Now with the rendering of the waterfall, there were some extra things that I wanted to add in order to be able to composite it with even more detail. So if I go to this Properties tab, and I scroll down here, you see we have this extra image planes option, and it's reading 3 right now. What I've done is I've added some extra image planes that we can break out during rendering. So let me just render the waterfall so you can see what those actually look like. So basically I've broken into 3 parts, but you can certainly get more. If we actually click this, you'll see this very long list of image planes that we could add to our render. In this case, I've just added the diffuse, the refractions, and the reflections. So here's our water sort of by itself, and it's just rendering along now. But if I open up this toolbar here, you'll see that we have a couple of options in this drop-down menu. We have the diffuse, the refract, and the reflect, and some other options that can be used for a variety of things. If I just click on all refract right now, the image goes quite dark. Let me just use this to brighten it up so you can see it. So here's just our refractions with no reflections, no diffuse, no it's just purely what is being refracted. This is going to give us great control when we get into our compositing setup. Same thing for just the reflections, for instance. Again, if I boost this up, you'll be able to see it a lot clearer. You can see that we have all this blue from the sky, and we got some reflections of the rocks that are in here as well. And then just the diffuse, which in this case may not even be anything. Yeah, there's a very, very small, if I really boost this up, you can see a tiny amount of diffuse that I did put on the surface, just to give it a little lighting information. And if I go back to the sea, which is essentially the beauty pass, you can see them all sort of composited together. What's great about this is that we're actually getting a ton of control. Each render node is not only rendering different objects and different mats or different phantom objects, but also different render layers such as reflections and refractions. And that's really going to give us like the most possible control when we get to compositing. So let's actually jump over to our composite view now. You'll see I've already set up a compositing network here. If you jump inside the compositing pane, you'll see a basic setup, and here's our overall composite. But essentially what I've done is broken out all the layers that we just rendered out. Here's our reflections, our refractions, our diffuse, our spray pass, and our landscape. I've added a couple of color correction nodes and some very simple compositing in order to end up with this beauty pass. But actually, let's just take a look at our original animation to get an idea of where this could go. As you can see, here are all the passes that I talked about, as well as some atmosphere and some overall color correction. And you know, the idea was to try and make the image as sort of rich as possible and give it a real warm, sort of afternoon, hazy feeling in order to really sort of bring it to life. So before I go, I just want to make sure I redirect you back to the web page, because it would be great if you could get this scene file and really dig into some of the stuff I didn't necessarily cover in the video. So I hope you learned a lot, and thank you very much for your time.